Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm looking at the presidential election of 1968, looking at Nixon's victory and some of its implications, and obviously trying to dig into why it happened, and in doing so looking into the enormous mess which was the Democrat Party at the time. So this is designed for A-level history, in particular for the AQA Specification 2Q, the American Dream, Reality and Illusion, 1945 to 1980, and we are looking at the presidential election of 1968 and the reasons for Nixon's victory, divisions within the Democratic Party, the personalities and policies of Nixon's administrations. So let's crack on with that. So to start off with, let's have a look at a bit of data on the presidential election of 1968. As you can see, it is a slightly odd one. So if we look at the column on the Electoral College, then it looks like just a resounding victory for Nixon. But if we compare the popular vote and the percentage of that popular vote held by Nixon and Humphrey, they are incredibly close. So we're looking at a very, very fine margin of victory, and obviously with this big impact from a third candidate, that is Wallace, who was representing the American Independent Party, and his contribution was really significant. So he runs on a pro-segregationist view ticket. He wins 5 states in the Deep South, racks up almost 10 million votes, and takes 13.5% of the popular vote. So Wallace's division, or taking away what being traditionally the Democrat kind of solid South, leaves the door open for Nixon. So Democrat division really is fundamentally at the heart of Nixon's victory. So it was an odd election. It was a battle between the person who was Humphrey, who was the vice president at the time, and Nixon, who was a former vice president. Nixon had led the polls by a long way going into October, and then Johnson suspended bombing in Vietnam and proposed peace talks that the North Vietnamese accepted. This appeased some of the anti-war protesters in the Democrat Party, and they came back into the fold, and Humphrey narrowed the gap, but failed to actually fully catch up with Nixon. Nixon had contacted the South Vietnamese, telling them to refuse to participate in these peace talks, as he would get them better terms once he'd won the election. These secret talks that he held with the South Vietnamese seemed to be effective, and it kind of the South Vietnamese reaction took the wind out of Humphrey's sails, so to speak. So Humphrey didn't get quite as big a bump from Johnson's actions as Johnson would have hoped for. So a really interesting election, and one that has a huge significance going forward. And we can see here again Nixon involved in a really tight election, just as he had been in 1960, but this time getting across the line. Now, the raw numbers failed to fully demonstrate the enormity of the divisions in America in 1968. So the standing president, Lyndon B. Johnson, had pulled out of the race due to opposition to his policies. Herbert Humphrey became the Democrat candidate. He didn't compete in the primaries. A lot of the states weren't decided by primaries. There was block votes by party bosses in those states, and so Humphrey concentrated on those rather than winning the primaries. The Democrat race saw the assassination of the rising star of the Democrat Party, who was Bobby Kennedy. He won the California primary. There's still debate whether Kennedy would have gone on and won the candidacy. I mean, the liberal left absolutely loved Kennedy. He had a kind of huge groundswell of support, particularly amongst the poor and the marginalized groups in America. Whether this would have been enough in the election is hard to say. George Wallace, I've already mentioned, was a segregationist, was the Democrat governor of Alabama. And him standing as a third-party candidate attracted the votes in the South, but also in parts of the Midwest, with his kind of pro-segregationist, socially conservative and economic populist policies. listening to this in the modern day, you might kind of go, well, that sounds a bit reminiscent of the party, the party on the other side, and this really is where this kind of big switch takes place in between the kind of the southern support for the Democrats and the southern support for the Republicans. So Wallace leaves the Democrat Party and keeps this to kind of isolate off this southern vote. We'll see this southern vote then moving to Nixon later on, and then from that point onwards remaining very solidly Republican up until the modern day. So the policies of Wallace, with particularly the social conservatism and economic populism, maybe sees echoes today in parts of the Republican Party rather than the Democrat Party. Wallace's candidacy lost a bit of steam towards the end and rather collapsed and fell away, in part due to his running mate LeMay, who was calling for Vietnam to be bombed back to the Stone Age, and even spoke about the potential use of nuclear weapons. So we've got this kind of enormously divided America. The Democrat Party has almost got an entire political spectrum in it at this point in time, from the hard right of George Wallace through to the highly liberal and progressive groups who were protesting against the war. So a real mixture here, and we talk in the modern day about how divided America is. Well, it's not a uniquely modern phenomena. We definitely could go back to 1968 and say at that point this was possibly the most divided America had ever been. So in the elections, the Democrats, although losing the presidency, kept control of both the House and the Senate, so that was going to make Nixon's job quite difficult. Nixon actually won 2.5 million fewer votes than he had in 1960 when he'd lost to Kennedy, and again this is partly the Wallace effect as the third candidate, picking up a large chunk of the vote. Nixon pledged to bring about an end to the war in Vietnam and win the peace. Well, he definitely eventually brings about the end of the war. Again, whether he won the peace is probably something for another video in terms of looking at his foreign policy. Now, Nixon's political career had seemed to be over. He'd lost to Kennedy in 1960. He then lost the election to be California's governor in 1962. He took a job in a New York law firm, but continued to campaign and raise money for the party. And in this, he won round a lot of people within the party through his kind of dedication. And he was then seen as ideal in 1968 as he brought the Republicans back to a more moderate ground following the crushing defeat suffered by Goldwater in 1964. So Goldwater, again, had taken a kind of hardline, radical, socially conservative policy, wanting to massively reduce the state, and that kind of set of views and policies have been very roundly rejected in 1964, with Johnson winning a landslide victory. And what Nixon saw was, by moving away from the hard line of Goldwater to more moderate policies, that he could see a way to winning Middle America. Now, when Middle America, or as Nixon often refers to them as the silent majority, were increasingly frustrated and angry about the radical protests, the student protests, the civil rights protests and things at the time, anti-war protests in particular, and felt that they were being forgotten. Nixon prioritised what he called the Sun Belt, which is not only the Deep South in the east, but the kind of the whole of the south of America, going all the way across to California. And the Southwest was an area where the population was growing enormously. Things like technology, with things like air conditioning, it meant that parts of America that hadn't been highly inhabited now were becoming so. And so we see this kind of this shift away from the traditional North, particularly the Northeast, to this focus on what Nixon talked about as Middle America, who weren't in line with the liberal ideas of the elites of the Northeast. Nixon's election bid was helped greatly by the endorsement of Eisenhower, And in a kind of a bit added a little bit of glamour to the whole campaign was Eisenhower's grandson David getting engaged to Nixon's daughter Julie. And those two in particular added a bit of glamour and attraction to young voters on the campaign trail, and Nixon's family all became kind of key figures in speaking on his behalf and appealing to voters, in particular Julie. The campaign was a really bitter one. It involved negative attack ads on both sides. So the Republicans connected Humphrey to Vietnam battle footage and ghetto riots, was he was talking about these idealized policies, and the kind of like, this is the reality of what happens under the Democrats, and the Democrats attacked Nixon, and in particular his running mate. Now, the divisions within the Democrat Party were unbelievably big at this point in time. So we've already talked a bit about George Wallace, but the starting point with it all was that there was on the Liberal side of the party, there was Eugene McCarthy, who was persuaded to run against Johnson. And essentially he acts as what often in British politics might refer to as a stalking horse. So he went in, I'm not sure he particularly felt he had any chance of winning, but he gained a lot of support, particularly from young Democrats who were unhappy with the Johnson's continuing with the war. And McCarthy won 42% of the vote in the New Hampshire primary, in contrast to Johnson's 49%. Now, this, alongside the widespread unpopularity of his policies, it convinced Johnson not to run in '68. And so it looked like the Democrats might be open to a kind of a more highly liberal candidate than before. Also on the Liberal side of the party was Bobby Kennedy. Now, people had tried to persuade him to run against Johnson, and he hadn't, and they kind of so he was a bit behind the eight ball because McCarthy had and he hadn't. But he decided, rather than endorsing McCarthy, that he would enter the race. Since his brother's assassination, he became a key figure in the progressive part of the party. He'd been a key spokesman on the plight of the poor and minority groups in America. Had a incredible kind of attachment to Kennedy. He was also a bit of a darling, particularly of the liberal press, and he made some really important and powerful speeches this time about the America being divided into two worlds. So there was the prosperous white world, and then there was the grim and poverty-filled world that many of the minority groups, particularly Black Americans, found themselves in. So Kennedy was more liberal, more progressive than McCarthy in lots of ways, and he appealed to the poor. McCarthy appealed to the middle classes, and this seems to be borne out in the primaries as they went forward. So Kennedy won in Indiana, where there was the kind of large areas of industry and lots of working class blue collar workers, whilst McCarthy won in Oregon. And there was also a concern in the Liberal side of the party that these guys might kind of coming against Humphrey, who would be the continuity candidate, and they might split the Liberal vote, allowing Humphrey in. However, kind of really tragic events were to follow. Kennedy won the important California primary and seemed to be kind of gaining momentum in the process, but then was assassinated by Sirhan, who was highly disturbed, believed Kennedy was too pro-Israel. So Sirhan was a pro-Palestinian dissident, and Kennedy is shot and tragically dies from his wounds. So yet another a political assassination at this point in the 60s, where we'd seen so many key figures assassinated already. Now, the Democrat convention then takes place in Chicago, and the groups decided to target this, including the Youth International Party, often referred to as Yippies, and they aimed to disrupt the convention. The Democrat mayor Daley mobilised a huge police presence that actually is said to have outnumbered the protesters. I think it's something like 10,000 versus 12,000 police and guards. There were violent clashes, lots of outrageous stuff going on outside on the streets, and then also within the in the convention hall. So Senator Rybakov accused Daley of Gestapo tactics in the streets. Daley responded with an expletive-ridden and anti-Semitic response, which he was shouting from the crowd, and lip readers got the every word of it, and therefore the exchange reached the front page of the newspapers, and then we could see this enormous tear, this entire division in the Democrat Party between the kind of the more traditional Democrats and the progressive liberals. And then we also saw the convention surrounded by disorder and violence, and this really played into Nixon's hand, who portrayed himself as the law and order candidate who was going to do something about these the children of these liberal elites who were causing chaos across the country's universities, and with all this mass protests. Also, Wallace and the Southern Democrats split from the party to run a separate campaign, and that third party vote is one of the reasons why the Democrats lose. Humphrey won the nomination, having not won a single primary again, so this then leads to changes going forward in the Democrat Party, who see this as not been the right way of doing things. The Democrat Party is hopelessly divided. McCarthy wouldn't endorse Humphrey, and therefore through Humphrey's campaigning, anti-war Democrats kept on disrupting his events and his campaigning. So the Democrats spent more time disrupting and attacking each other during the campaign than they did attacking the Republicans and Nixon. And in this, Nixon, you can almost be seen given a kind of almost an open goal with the '68 election. So the Democrats are horrendously divided. And if you think about a political spectrum going from Bobby Kennedy through to Wallace, then you've almost got an entire political spectrum in there within the one party. So it's not really surprising that the Democrat Party tears itself into pieces. So next I'm going to move on to the personalities of Nixon's administration. So we'll start with Nixon himself. Again, he's an interesting guy, Nixon. He built his political career on his anti-communism. He built his vice presidency on his specialism in foreign policy and numerous foreign visits that he meant. On domestic issues, although we would view him as a conservative, he was a moderate within his party at the time, far more moderate than Goldwater, who went before him. He was from a poor family in California. He aimed to speak for the silent majority, attacking the liberal elites and the radical protesters of the time. He courted celebrity friendships and photo ops and any opportunity he had to have his picture taken with the famous, be it Elvis or other key figures. But he was absolutely paranoid about his potential enemies, and he said in 1972 that he had an enemies list that included politicians and journalists and even celebrity actors and things. And Nixon will forever be associated with Watergate, and therefore dishonesty and underhandedness. So Dirty Dickie, as he's often referred to. There's a famous bit where he says, "I am not a crook," and the general view is by a lot of people that he was, and a lot of this kind of doing what he felt was in the best interest of America, regardless of the morality and things of it, is also seen in elements of his foreign policy, which he works on with Kissinger, so he's not generally rated very highly amongst American presidents. There's been a lot of revisionist work done on him in recent years, but it's very hard for him to shake the shadow of Watergate. Spiro Agnew, who was his running mate in '68 and '72, his vice president, He was Maryland's governor. Whilst Maryland governor, he clashed with black leaders in Baltimore. And he was seen as key by Nixon to winning Democrats in the Sun Belt, so the band across the South of America. And then he's seen by many as Nixon's Nixon. So his own hatchet man, like he'd done all the kind of the dirty work for Eisenhower. Now Agnew did it for him, so he could go further than Nixon could in attacking the protesters and the liberals. But again, he also ends his career in scandal, as he in '73 resigned following charges of tax evasion, which he didn't contest, and he steps down. So both the two key figures, the president and the vice president, are both end their time in office in scandal and corruption, and so this gives us a bit of an idea into the way that we often see Nixon's administration. Probably the most famous other personality in Nixon's administration is Henry Kissinger. So he was National Security Advisor 69 to 75 and Secretary of State 73 to 77. He was a Harvard University professor in international relations. He favoured realpolitik, which is doing whatever could practically be done, and kind of ignoring moral and ideological considerations. He tended to avoid traditional methods of doing diplomacy, and was seen by some of his colleagues and some of the media as being completely power crazy. Even Nixon himself said that, oh, people think he's power crazy, and they're probably not completely wrong. He was renowned for clashing with William Rogers, who was Secretary of State before him, who he considered to be uninformed and just not very bright. Rogers considered Kissinger to be completely Machiavellian and power mad. Kissinger was notoriously bad for treating his staff, treated them like mushrooms, apparently, kept them in the dark, trod on them a lot, covered them in manure. And he was also known for keeping company of glamorous Hollywood actresses, described power as a great aphrodisiac. So Kissinger, an interesting character and quite a divisive character. Other key figures in Nixon's administration were Haldeman, his chief of staff, and Ehrlichman, his domestic affairs advisor, and these two men kind of controlled access to Nixon, and they were both heavily implicated in Watergate. There's also implicated in this is John Mitchell, who was Attorney General 69 to 72, and then headed Nixon's re-election campaign. He tried to block the publishing of the Pentagon Papers, which shed presidents in a negative light surrounding Vietnam. He approved illegal wiretaps. He was strongly anti-press and tried to suppress stuff coming out in the press, including Watergate. So he was very tight-lipped and wanted to stop anything getting in the press. But interestingly, his wife was a notorious gossip and therefore got a lot of attention from the newspapers. Moving on to the policies of Nixon's administration, well, one of the main things he said he was going to do was restore law and order in the cities. Nixon highlighted the high crime rate in Washington. Members of his own office were mugged and burgled. The District of Columbia Control Act was passed in '70, granting police ability to search suspects and increasing the levels of bail to try and make bail harder to get. Nixon's administration went after protesters, notably the Chicago 8, which included Bobby Seale, and they were charged with conspiracy, crossing state lines to form an anti-war riots at the Democrat convention. 5, including Bobby Seale, were convicted, but later won appeals. 28 Black Panthers were killed by the police and hundreds imprisoned in 1969. So we see Nixon kind of cracking down on protests. Even his inauguration saw violent anti-war protests, including flag burning, objects such as beer bottles and things being thrown at Nixon's limousine, clashes between protesters and police. The biggest protests on university campuses came in October and November '69. Students blew up buildings at the University of Colorado over the freezing of scholarships to black students. In San Diego, banks were set on fire. In Ohio State, there was a 6-hour battle between police and students. 7 students were shot, 13 injured, and 600 arrested. And then again, the protests continued and the clashes continued into 1970, where 4 students were shot dead at Kent State, and then 2 more were shot dead at Jackson State following protests and alleged protests. And so he claims he can restore law and order. He definitely steps down on protests, but the violence in a lot of ways actually gets worse. One of his other policies that he said he was going to do was to bring peace with honour in Vietnam. Well, he does eventually get to the point of peace in Vietnam. Whether it is with honour is still highly debated, and again, that's something I'll look at in terms of foreign policy in a later video. He talks about there being less and cheaper government. So he proposed this idea of new federalism, whereby moving power away from federal government back to the states, in part through the use of block grants, which states had more freedom to spend money as they saw fit. Nixon spoke against the wasteful and inefficient policies of the Great Society project under Johnson. The opinion polls at the time suggested the Americans were on side with him. 84% agreed with him that too many people were on welfare. Nixon vetoed the 1971 Child Development Act, which would have provided free childcare for poor mothers to enable them to work. So in this, we see him taking a really hard line on welfare, trying to cut back the cost and size of the state. His record, however, on welfare isn't that straightforward. Despite a lot of his rhetoric, he was from a poor family himself and sympathetic to the plight of the poor, and actually spent more money on social programs than Johnson did. And so in that, Nixon's kind of legacy in terms of this idea of less and cheaper government is not 100% clear. He's criticised by the Liberal Democrat, the Liberals in the Democrat Party for not doing enough and scaling back policies, and he's criticised by a lot of Conservatives for having having provided too much welfare and support and not done enough to scale back the size of the state. So I hope that's been a helpful introduction to Nixon and his policies, as well as an explanation of the 1968 election. So this video is part of a series covering the American unit that goes from 1945 to 1980. So there's more videos on the other aspects on that playlist. There's also lots on my channel covering other areas of history and politics. So if you haven't subscribed already, please do, and check out some of the other stuff. Thank you very much for watching.